from the other hand, to know whether this presents, how it is affected the behavior to the banking sectors of these countries of Visegrad 4, and how the technical efficiency of this bank changed from the war period. I use the periodization from 2013 to 2019. Why? Because it's the period of some recovery of the economy, of financial recovery of these countries after the financial crisis. After 2008 to 2012, when the economies of these countries were recovering from the crisis. Next slide. So the content of my presentation is slightly brief. Firstly, I will introduce why investigating the banks is so important. Then I will briefly describe my methodology that I use to do so. Data variables where I download and get data from the banks. Then briefly about asset share and efficiency scores, statistical significance of difference in group efficiency, and also the very important things is to discuss the foreign capital origin participation from which group of countries the efficiency was the most or the worst. And of course the topic of Poland, because in Poland there are not only banks from Europe, you know, the most maybe Santander Bank from Spain, it is active in Poland, and also bank from the United States. Foreign banks model participations, civil and common law efficiency scores, how it also affected, and conclusions. Next slide. So, why banks is so important? The banking system is a guarantor of financial security of states. Why? Because the banks, their main important task is to allocate the resources of the economy. It leads to the drive of the economic growth. And as economic growth of the states depends on the efficiency of the national and international banking sectors, it's important to conclude whether domestic commercial banks and foreign banks, how they function in the national banking sectors. It's important because if in the banking sector there are a huge dominance of the foreign participation, it's not bad, but if something happens, some crises, some recession in the world, it affects all the banking sectors where the foreign participation is huge. If foreign participation is very low, it's also bad because the banking sectors become very influenced by the performance of state also and private investors. So it's also not good. The best percentage that was described by the National Bank of Ukraine is 38% of foreign entry in the banking sectors of the countries. Next slide. Yes, so about the methodology that I use. We use mainly data environment analysis techniques in order to determine the technical efficiency of the banks. It's very comfortable because this provides us with the average efficiency level of each type of the bank and the country in the region. Next slide. So, in order to implement the methodology, we can observe a sample of K from L to K banks that make use of sets of n inputs represented by X, and to produce the set of m outputs, namely Y, it is also assumed that inputs and outputs are all non-negative. In easy words, we use dependent and independent variables. Dependent variables, it's more like staff expenses, total equity, non-earning assets that do not give banks some input, and also total customer deposits. And independent variables, gross loans, and securities. Securities, you know, is important to have the banking liquidity. So we also analyze this. And total assets of all categories of banks. Next slide. So our empirical study based on the data that we receive from the Moody's database, called also the Bank Focus Analytics. This database contains more than 46,000 banks worldwide. But our data set, of course, includes only 113 commercial banks, referring to years from 2013 to 2019, from 4 countries of the Visegrad 4, you know, Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, because all these countries, they share the close cultural and political alliance. All these countries, they are the members of NATO and European Union. And they also have maybe more or less the same history. So the sample is this one. And according to the information provided by the Moody's Analytics Bank Focus dataset, we have 655 observations, 2,000 observations belonging to the domestic banks, and 2,050 correspond to foreign banks. Next slide. Yes, and other banks, other observation 202, so it's not applicable. Somewhat it can be. So we have domestic commercial banks. What it differ? It divides on the banks with stake share. It may be referred to Hungary, where stake share is large, and also to Poland. In Poland, state-owned banks is Bank PKO, and also Bank Pekao. And if about foreign banks, of course, Santander, mBank, and BNP Paribas. It also have its banks filials in Poland. In Slovakia, the domestic banks are absent. What about I said that some countries like Slovakia, like also Croatia, that they have more than 90% of foreign participation. So these countries are more influenced to the foreign crises, some foreign shocks. Yes. Next slide. Yes. Talking about some changes in total assets. In Poland, the growth of total assets, we can see it from the 2016 to 2019, the growth of assets of domestics and foreign banks. But domestic banks growth, it was refused in 2018, but it was some growth in 2019. But the most reliable growth was by the foreign banks. The opposite tendency was in Hungary. We can see that the total share of assets by domestic banks, they rose from 59 billion euro to 74. And foreign banks, the growth was more reduced. Why? Because of the policy of Hungarian policymakers, Hungarian government, to reduce the domestic, to reduce the foreign participation and to support domestic commercial banks. So in Czech Republic, 83% of the whole banking systems is participated by the foreign banks. Domestic share is quite low, 29 billion euros in 2018. It's very low. In Poland, this indicator is 46%, so more than 38% as a recommendation from the National Bank of Ukraine. And in Slovakia, it's pretty easy. It's not complicated, only foreign banks, and steady growth of foreign banks participation. Next slide. So comparing, talking about assets share and efficiency scores. So you can see as for all Visegrad banks, in 2019, it was 28 of domestic banks representation, and foreign banks a large stake, 72%. But if we're talking about the efficiency indicators, efficiency scores, we see that foreign banks efficiency, it reduces. It's quite low until the 2017, but it rose to 2019. Why? Also because the assets share growth, and also due to the stabilization of the world economy. It was not stabilized in 2012, 2013, but only from 2017 it was growth. But I was not included in this presentation. In 2012, when the COVID pandemic was, the efficiency of foreign banks was lowered by some points, but not so huge. In Poland, the tendency was opposite because of the government support of the domestic banks, also state banks. But in 2019, we can see that the domestic banks' efficiency was lowered. Next slide. Yes, and distinguishing between countries. So the country with the most domestic share is Poland, of course. But as you can see in the graphic from 2017 to 2019, there is a slight reduction in the domestic share. But if we talk about the efficiency scores, domestic banks showed some growth of the efficiency from the 0.7 to 0.7 and 6. To describe these efficiency indicators, if it is closer to 1, the banks are more efficient. If it is less than 0.6, the efficiency of banks is bad, of course. In the Czech Republic, the efficiency of foreign banks is quite huge, even more than 0.8 and 5. And the domestic banks in Czech Republic is lower than 0.5. In Slovakia, talking about the tendency of foreign banks is quite turbulent. But in 2018-2019, it was stabilized in the indicator 0.68. And in Hungary, domestic banks are the only country where domestic banks are more efficient than foreign, but due to the government policy to supporting the domestic commercial banks. Next slide. Yes, about the statistical significance of the difference in group efficiency. Kolmogorov-Smirnov test and Mann and Whitney test. This is a non-parametric linear test, it is important to conclude whether foreign and the domestic banks, which category is performed the best. And Kolmogorov-Smirnov test, it is more sensitive. It shows exactly that foreign banks are more efficient. And by this indicator 0.7, if it is closer to 0, yes, foreign banks are more efficient. Mann and Whitney test is not so sensitive. Also because of Hungary and Poland, where we cannot exactly set that foreign banks are more efficient. In Poland, it's much more equal. In Hungary, domestic banks are more efficient. Next slide. Yes, about the foreign capital origin participation. The first thing that I must say that mostly foreign participation is these countries are from European Union, from European countries. But the main exclusion is Poland. Poland, because the United States holds the stake of 10% of all foreign commercial banks. In the Czech Republic, some banks was Russian, 0.5%, and in Poland also some banks was Norway. We can see also the Asia participation in the banking sector of Hungary. But yes, it's quite low, it's slightly more than 1%. Next slide. Okay, about Poland. So in case of Poland, we have United States banks, and also we can compare the efficiency of foreign banks from Europe and United States. In 2015-2016, the United States banks, of course, Citibank, were more efficient. But then the tendency changed. It changed very rapidly from 2017 to 2018. And the United States banks were less efficient, even the efficiency was 0.4. But it slightly grows to the more or less positive tendency in 2019. It was 0.6. But of course, the European foreign banks dominate the Polish banking sector. Of course, the efficiency scores are very good, very positive. So we can say about the slowdown of the US foreign investment in the Visegrad Group banking sector that led to the worsening of these indicators. Next slide. Yes, also we can say more or less about the comparison of the models of participation. It also will be constructive because the different legal systems, they may be influencing the foreign evolution of the foreign participation, and therefore the impact in each one of the markets examined. There are generally considered to be 5 legal systems in the world today: civil law, common law, customary law, religious law, and mixed legal systems. But mainly we talk in our Visegrad Group countries about civil law and common law. Civil law dominates the Visegrad Group countries, but in Poland and Slovakia, common law is represented by 11 and 7.9%. Next slide. Yes, and how it affected the efficiency. So we can see that in Slovakia the tendency is fluctuative, more or less, but as in Poland, civil law more positively affects the banking efficiency in charge of common law. And in Slovakia, the tendency is more or less equal, but from 2017 to 2019, we can see the difference that also the civil law more reacts the efficiency of the banks. Next slide. So to conclude about all the information that was given in this presentation, from the analyzed data, we can say that efficiency in the observed period from 2013 to 2018, both of domestic banks and foreign banking groups and Central and Eastern Europe, in terms of efficiency, we can say that foreign banks were more efficient in Poland, in Czech Republic, in Slovakia, but in Hungary, domestic banks showed the greater technical efficiency due to the government policy. And several factors that influenced the banking system is the high concentration of total banking assets, and the branches of national banks are scattered almost everywhere in the countries studied. It's more or less about the large percent of foreign banks, why they showed the greater technical efficiency scores. Next slide. Yes, and foreign banks with the participation of member countries of European Union reach a percentage of participation in these countries 95%. So what we can say is that again, the participation and the influence and the activeness of foreign banks in the Visegrad Group countries are huge, and it hugely influence the banking sector's performance and of course the economies of these countries that are dependent on the efficiency scores of these banks. So it's important for me, like a science, to continue to investigate these tendencies. Of course, if we talk about the coronavirus period and 2022 year, and 2023, when a lot of political and also economic turbulence happened. And also it will be interesting to analyze the tendencies that happened in these years. Next slide. Yes, thank you for your attention. I hope that the information that I described was quite simple, but it was not looking like that.
Dzień dobry. Доброго дня. My name is Angela Bayrochenko. I represent Odessa National University, named after Ilyi Miecznikowa. I am a first-year PhD student, and I study translation, since this is my main specialty for the last 18 years. Could you please show the next slide? So like what we are going to talk about today. So first of all, the topic of my speech is the political tweeting of President Zelensky. And we are going to discuss features that social media Twitter has. So we are going to discuss the challenges that occur in translation from Ukrainian to English, and also the methods particularly used for translation of tweets by President Zelensky. Next slide, please. Word has always been the most powerful weapon in the world. I truly believe so, and I think President Zelensky showed this to us during the full-scale invasion of Russia, and the messages he's conveying are particularly strong. Many people are following now him on the social media, and we can see that he's got the rating of the 7.3 million of followers on Twitter. So it's particularly important to convey his messages in English for English-speaking audience correctly. So that's why this is my part of the investigation of my research devoted to this topic. And Twitter has always been a place for politicians, so it's like historical social media for politicians who published their messages, their thoughts there. And Vladimir Zelensky is not exception from this cohort. And also, what is particularly interesting about his Twitter messages that before the war, sometimes he posted English messages, and they were first and then translated to Ukrainian. And after the beginning of the full-scale invasions, his messages started to be first in Ukrainian and then translated to English and to some other different languages, which I think underlines the importance of the Ukrainian messages that go first. Can you do the next slide, please? Thank you. Although there are some challenges that occur in translation, if we're translating from Ukrainian to English and vice versa, this is because English and Ukrainian belong to different language groups and they have different structures. It's obvious. Starting from the alphabet and very simple things like Ukrainian alphabet has got 34 characters and 40 phonemes, which means the sounds, unique sounds that are produced. While in English there are only 26 letters and there are more sounds, like 44 phonemes in English. And the length of words, it was curious for me to learn that actually Ukrainian words are much longer than the English one. I was frequently asked this question, so I Googled, and it appeared that an average word in English is like 4.7 characters, while in Ukrainian it's 7.9, so like it's almost 2 times longer. Why this is particularly important for Twitter messages? Because before March 2023, there was a strict limitation of the Twitter messages. So like it used to be 140 characters only, so the messages were very short. Then it started to be 280 characters, which is also a pretty short message. And starting from the March 2023, the capability enlarged to 2,000 characters, which is also like, or maybe 4,000, I think 4,000 characters, which is like 2 pages A4, like the normal format, which makes longer opportunities in that. Also, when we speak about the challenges of Ukrainian and English translations, of course, we need to mention the tenses. The system of the tenses in Ukrainian and in English are very different. And for example, in English, there are many auxiliary verbs that appear if you change the tense. Grammar construction. In Ukrainian, it's very common to omit the subject, for example, and this is the technique that was used by President Zelensky to shorten the messages. While in English, it is not really possible, and the translator has to face this challenge to put extra characters, like 4 or 5 characters in there. And also contractions. yes, used flexions of the verbs, because like in English, some verbs do not change and they do not have flexions, while in Ukrainian, all the verbs actually are changed. The next slide, please. So what are the main methods generally to translate the texts? There are 4 of them, and these are transcoding, so like transliteration or maybe transcription go to this category. Tracing, calc, so this means that we are just doing the same word in another language. Equivalent translation and descriptive translation. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay. Who told me that they won't show the red underlined things? Okay. So descriptive translations, it's not really used in Twitter because, as you can see, so I made 2 examples to show you how long it can be to explain the word that does not exist in the language in another words. Yes, so this part of the translation is not used in Twitter because obviously it makes the message unreasonably longer. Next slide, please. And what is used then? So we have the equivalent translation. This is a very nice situation when we have words that exist in English and in Ukrainian, and we can use it. And just to make an equivalent, sometimes this equivalent is longer, sometimes it is shorter, but it's still okay. So like the examples you can see on the screen. Next slide, please. And what happens if we have the concept that either does not exist in the different language, or it should be translated, or the message should be conveyed differently? So we can use some different techniques to do that. First of them is transcoding or transliteration. Like lots of my foreign friends learned the word Ukrzaliznytsia, and they learn how long Ukrzaliznytsia is to get to Kiev, for example, not using a flight. So we can see that this is just the conveying the same message in just Latin letters, or like the word Zaporizhia, and also included Odessa. Because Odessa is a very controversial word, you know, that depending on from what language you're going to transliterate, it will have either one S spelling or 2 S spelling, yes? And many foreigners do not understand this difference, and I need to explain to my friends that Ukrainian Odessa should be spelled with 1 S, because in Ukrainian language, it is written with 1 S and not with 2. Okay, and the next slide, please. Also, tracing or calc is used for concepts that do not exist in English, like hetman, or like Slava Ukraini, which is now a brand word. So sometimes it's translated like glory to Ukraine. Everyone knows that, but people who want to be authentic, they keep telling Slava Ukraini. Or like the words like Verkhovna Rada and other things, because it represents just the concept that is present in Ukrainian language. And the last slide, please. To conclude, I would say that I know that many people think that numbers matter or like statistics, but as humanitarian, I must say that words matter, and actually the characters. So you can see if we change the letter, it completely changes the meaning. So we should be very careful with what we are putting in our words, and I think that Volodymyr Zelensky team is doing a brilliant job because they are doing practically identical translations within these complicated circumstances to put these messages in a very short period of time, in a very short number of characters. So I think that we should compliment them and maybe follow Twitter if you're interested in getting more information about that. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Good day, everyone. As it was mentioned, my name is Елизавета Karliuka, and I am a first-year PhD student at the Odessa National Miecznikowa University. And today, I would like to present you the topic, Russian disinformation and propaganda regarding Ukraine in the light of its war of aggression and its impact on democratic processes in the European Union. So the first question is why we are talking about that. Because this full-scale war against Ukraine is a vibrant example of the so-called hybrid warfare, which is waged by applying conventional military, but also not military measures. The latter are presented by deeply incorporated in Russian military doctrine elements of propaganda and disinformation. Next slide, please. So what is disinformation? The EU defines disinformation as verifiably false or misleading information created, presented, and disseminated for economic gain or to internationally deceive the public, which may cause public harm, and threats to democratic, political, and policymaking processes, as well as public goods. That means, in turn, that disinformation is a conscious attempt to encourage people to believe something that the producers and or disseminators of the content know to be untrue for sure, and that the producers and or disseminators of this information act out of malicious intent. Next slide, please. Propaganda. It can be defined as the strategic information campaigns designed and implemented by Russia so as to first mislead the population, as well as to interfere with the public's right to know and the right of individuals to seek, receive, spread information and ideas of all kinds, and secondly, to influence democratic processes in Ukraine and beyond. However, it is worth mentioning that, in fact, propaganda and disinformation, they are using interchangeably, and mostly they can be considered synonyms. Next slide, please. As it was mentioned before, disinformation and propaganda constitute consciousness activities, which implies that they may have certain aims. Regarding Ukraine, these aims are the fragmentation of Ukrainian population, the disruption of faith in the Ukrainian government, the war justification, discrediting the image of Ukraine among its Western partners, supporting a portrayal of Russian military greatness and superiority, and the last one, distraction and obfuscation of the facts of war crimes perpetrated by Russian troops. Next slide, please. Now I would like to switch to the key periods of Russian disinformation and propaganda. It is very interesting that some scholars argue that these disinformation and propaganda campaigns are waged by Russia since 2013. Exactly since the Eastern Partnership Summit in Vilnius took place. And why is that so? Just because during that summit, Ukraine expressed its adherence to the European vector of its development, and then President Putin regarded this step as crossing the line. Since then, Russian pro-government mass media started being actively involved in bringing to life the key narratives which were outlined in the strategic policy document of the Russian Federation called National Security Strategy of the Russian Federation until 2020. These narratives comprise the ideas of the inadequacy of the current global and regional architecture, which was obviously oriented towards NATO, the unacceptability of NATO's expansion, as well as the necessity of prevention of Ukraine's closer integration with NATO. And also, the last narrative which was spread is the Russian world, a very famous Russian world, which should be united by different means and which is initially opposite to all the Western civilizations. The next year, 2014, it is featured by the brunt of Russian disinformation and propaganda, which increased significantly, and that in turn implied the extension of tools and methods which were applied during that period. Here we can observe the isolation from sources of information other than pro-Kremlin ones inside Russia itself. It was made by adopting laws restricting freedom on the internet, tightening censorship, and expanding the powers of intelligence agency. Also, there was some Russian government-backed media which started broadcasting in the West, and also, which is very noticeable, is that there were a lot of bloggers and trolls on social media which spread pro-Kremlin messages. And also it should be mentioned that apart from these factors, Russia managed to elaborate some new narratives and extending the already existing ones, like Ukrainians are not an independent nation, Ukraine has no statehood, and for example, also Russia's actions regarding the Crimea are legitimate just because the self-proclaimed government in Crimea asked Russia for help. because there Ukraine deprived the local population of their right to use Russian language, because it cancelled the history, which was common for Ukraine and Russia, and also the very common and widespread narrative that the West is evil, because it didn't keep its promise not to extend to the Eastern Europe, in particular to Ukraine, and plus the West itself has breached all the possible laws by intervening in Iraq, in Syria, and so on and so on. Next slide, please. So the next period is from 2018 till 2022. And actually, this period is considered to be the preparation of the ground for the actions we are witnessing right now in Ukraine. It is remarked by March 2018, when the president of the Russian Federation was re-elected once again. And since then, the Russian media became much more assertive and hostile towards Ukraine. And they started speculating on the possibility of armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine. The next remarkable date is June 2021, when the Russia-United States summit was held. And then, during this summit, President Putin accused NATO for the first time of the military incorporation of Ukraine. Later on, there was an article which was written by Putin and which was published on the official website of the Kremlin. This article, in fact, refuses to consider Ukraine again a truly sovereign and independent state, and again reiterates this narrative that NATO wants to militarily incorporate the Ukrainian territory, which was unacceptable for him and for Russia itself. Then we switch to October 2021. There we can observe that the Russian Federation started using all possible information resources at its disposal to spread these anti-NATO accusations of military incorporation of the territory of Ukraine. And there were a lot of claims from the side of the Foreign Ministry of Russian Federation spokeswoman Maria Zakharova, also Sergei Shoigu, also Sergei Lavrov. Each time during their speeches, they underlined the fact of illegal military incorporation of the territory of Ukraine. And then the peak of this period is November 2021, when during one of the forums which was held in Russia, President Putin for the first time referred to these territories in the eastern part of Ukraine as those far unrecognized republics, that in sense meant that Russia is going to recognize them very soon. Next slide, please. And also now we will talk about Russian disinformation and propaganda during the war itself. So the propaganda and the disinformation model has preserved all the features it has had during the above-mentioned periods. In the literature, like the model which is applied by Russia is called also the fire hose of falsehood. And here we can see the following characteristics, like high numbers of channels and messages, which means that Russia doesn't stick only to one channel of information. It's not only the internet, it's not only the social media, social networks, not only the TV broadcasting, it's everything, and also messages. There are a lot of messages. They have different topics, different directions, and from this point, there is comes also rapidness and repetitiveness, which means that actually just because Russian disinformation and propaganda is not willing to be true, it doesn't want to correspond to the reality, so it doesn't have this need to wait, to clarify the information. We can see that information is just posted with no verification, and basically these messages are the interpretations of the events which are in favor for Russia. And the next feature is the lack of commitment to objective reality and consistency. which means again that Russia doesn't have any consistent line. It is keeping. If the message which it tried to deliver to the audience is not well received or was debunked, these informators do not hesitate. They immediately change to another message, even if it doesn't correspond to the previous one, even it contradicts actually previous one. And all these features are noticeable. For example, here you can see some pictures which reflect the narratives Russia has shared. For example, on the first picture, there is a line of people who live in the occupied territories in the eastern part of Ukraine. And according to USA intelligence services, on these territories, people were deprived of food, medicines, and water until they have received the Russian passports. And this line shows that people are waiting for these passports to receive food, medicines, and water. But on Russian websites, for example, it was presented like Ukrainians who are willing to join Russia, who are willing to join Russia. That's why they're waiting in the line to receive the passports. The second picture is about bombing Ukrainian cities. As far as we know, Russia always denies these facts that it bombs Ukrainian cities. And actually here you can check any Russian website which will have the same picture, but saying that these pictures do not depict Ukrainian territories. These are territories of other countries, and these pictures are manipulated by NATO. The third picture is the last one, and it tries to reflect the atrocities which were committed in Bucha. And again, I think all of us know that Russia again denied any participation in committing these atrocities, and it said that pictures were just staged. They were not true, and the actors took part in making these photos. Next slide, please. So what's the impact on the democratic processes in the EU? First of all, here we should mention that EU tries to deal with that, and there are several bans introduced which forbid Russian TV channels to broadcast on the EU territory, but nevertheless it doesn't work well. Why? Because very often Russian propaganda is picked up and rebroadcast by legitimate news outlets, and also we should not forget about those trolls and bot accounts which are operating on social media. So in the end, what do we have? We have trolls and bot accounts which pollute the opinion-forming process of EU residents that in turn contribute to the polarization of societies within individual member states, and this in the end undermines the EU's unity on decisions regarding Russia. Thank you very much for your attention.
So, good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me yet, probably, my name is Maria Kurando. I'm representing the Odeskiego Uniwersytetu National University. And I am also visiting doctoral fellow at the Institute of Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. So today I chose to speak to you about a rather acute topic about Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and what's going on there. I am a political scientist myself, so do not expect me to be too technical. But I hope that I'm going to shed some light on what's going on, and probably you won't be panicking that much when you see this troubling news that we are constantly seeing. So next slide, please. So, as usual, when we're talking about Ukraine and the war in general, we have more questions than answers. So here are the following questions that we're going to be discussing today. So the first one is, what are we actually talking about? What is nuclear security? What is nuclear safety? How Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant operates? What's going on there? Then we're going to talk about what actually happened. to this date, what are the main shortcomings of a nuclear security and safety regime, and what has been done so far, whether it's beneficial for us or not. So first of all, I'd like to ask you to look at this little map here. This is the map of nuclear reactors in Ukraine. So in Ukraine, we have 5 sites with nuclear power plants. These little dots are representing the nuclear power units. We have 4 in Rivne, 2 in Khmelnytsky, 3 in southern Ukraine, Chernobyl is closed, and 6 in Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which makes it the largest not only in Ukraine, but also in Europe. Next slide, please. So now I have to grab my notes and explain to you how Zaporizhia nuclear power plant works. So, first of all, it was constructed during the Soviet Union. The last unit was built, it seems to me, in 1996. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, certainly. The reactor utilizes the water system, or VVER system. So it is just the direct abbreviation, the transliteration of abbreviation from Russian language, which means water-to-water reactor. So I'll probably stand here. How does this work then? First of all, we have 2 separate coexisting circuits. This is the first one. This is the second one. The first one is secured by the containment building, which is made of concrete. So why it is secured? Because here we have the nuclear fuel. The nuclear fuel is generating the heat, which boils the water in the first circuit. It is controlled, the fission reaction is controlled by the control rods. In case of emergency, they just simply fall. So the water is heated by the nuclear reactor, by the nuclear fuel rods. It is then transferred to the steam generator. And here, it's a blessing. And here we have the combination with the second circuit. The second circuit has the pressure, and the water is pumped like that to the steam generator. The pressure that is twice as low as in the first circuit, which means that here in the steam generator, the water that comes from the second circuit vaporizes and goes and generates the steam, obviously. The steam then goes to the generator. It rotates the turbine, then it generates the electricity. It goes to the switchyard, and then the country, an Ergotar, and so on. Here, obviously, this water, the steam, then is processed. It goes right here, because like during this long road to success, it is somehow cools down, and that's why here we have the hot liquid. The hot liquid then is cooled by this pump, which brings its water from, in case of Zaporizhia, the cooling water pond. How it's connected? You understand, the Kakhovka dump was destroyed, the upstream reservoir is feeding the nuclear power plant, so that's why it's important. And then the cool water goes again and again and again. Here, this pump is also processing the water. It also cools here and goes back to the reactor. So why am I talking about this? First of all, for you to know. Second of all, because this is the system that is so far considered to be the safest system. Obviously, it was constructed in late 80s, in early 90s. It is not like the kind of a Athlon thing, but we are constantly developing our technology. Who does it? International Atomic Energy Agency, who is basically in charge of viewing the nuclear security and safety procedures, and who is issuing recommendation on how safely you can use the nuclear energy. Because here, this is kind of a problematic thing, the fuel, which is radioactive. Next slide, please. So, radioactive fuel, or nuclear materials, are found, well, not only in industrial things or in nuclear power plants, they also can be found in hospitals, veterinary clinics, obviously nuclear weapons, and academic institutions such as, for example, the research reactors and so on. So this is extremely important to understand what we're doing with these nuclear materials, because they can be used, obviously, for malicious actions, such as, for example, terrorists obtaining nuclear materials and then using them to create a dirty bomb and then having a big boom somewhere in a city. So here we have three main concepts that the International Atomic Agency worked with. First one is safeguards, then security and safety. Safeguards is basically the accountability of nuclear materials that we have at sites. Nuclear safety and security, they're somewhat combined. So for example, nuclear safety, it primarily deals with unintended risks. So for example, it's happened in Fukushima when the natural disaster kind of launched this the catastrophe. We have the human errors, meaning that the person cannot react on some malfunctions that are happening inside. And nuclear security here focuses more on intended malicious actions. For example, if we do have terrorists who want to come to some university or to nuclear power plant and steal the nuclear materials and then use them in their malicious actions. So this is basically the physical integrity of the nuclear facilities. So this distinction that they have currently in Ukraine, it is somewhat blurred, obviously, because yeah, well, you can judge. So now, next slide, please. Now you can see how it basically works. So it's just like the synergy of how it should be and how in reality it actually is. So the problem is that if one of these so-called 3S is under risk, the whole system is under risk. Next slide, please. So what's happening in Zaporizhia? Well, the easy answer is too much for it to bear, honestly. It is quite unexpected. It is quite unprecedented due to several reasons. First of all, it was occupied by the state army on March 2022. And it is not the first time when we generally see the hostilities going around the nuclear power plants. It's happening in Slovenia, it's happening in Iraq. It was elsewhere in the world. But this is the first time when we have the operating nuclear reactor, which is under the occupation of the state army of another state. Then you have to understand that for a nuclear power reactor, it is not the direct shelling that is only the problem for this power plant. It is also, for example, the access to the external power line, because external power line is something that is that provides electricity for the cooling system of the plant. Now, if the cooling system isn't working, then it can lead to the meltdown of the reactor core, and it potentially may lead to the contamination of the area in case that the reactor core will be melted and it's going to be like literally on Earth. So, in case of Zaporizhia, during the combo battle, Zaporizhia has lost its external power supply for 8 times. The last one occurring, actually, it seems to me on Tuesday of July 4th. Likely right now we have like the external power line, the main one, and we have restored just in the beginning of the month the additional backup power line, but it is still fragile considering that before war we had 6 of such lines. Also, Nova Kakhovka Dam is damaged. So what does it mean? It doesn't mean that we have the intermediate risk for Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. But again, as you see on the diagram, we have the cooling pond, which is fed by the water from Nova Kakhovka reservoir, which is upstream the Nova Kakhovka Dam. So in time, in future, sometime later, probably there's going to be such situation when we do not have the supply from Nova Kakhovka reservoir. And we have not, surprisingly, understood how to pump the water back into the cooling pond. And the cooling pond water will vaporize and then we just do not have water. And then when we are starting to talk about the catastrophe, you know, but it's not going to be like in 2 days, it's not going to be like weeks, it's not going to be even in months. And on the plus side, we have time. Because like we know what's going on there. We know, and there are monitoring missions, so everything is under control right now, so do not panic. So next slide, please. So what are the shortcomings for the nuclear security regime and for the procedures in general and recommendation of the International Atomic Energy Agency? So first of all, nuclear facilities are not designed to withstand large-scale military action. The containment building, which I was pointing to in the beginning of presentation, is fine with some damage. For example, you can hit it with a plane. For example, if there's going to be a shelling nearby the facility, it's nothing going to happen to this containment building. But in case you are deliberately shelling the power plant and the containment, there has to be 2 or 3 missiles, for example, that can actually make a hole in the containment building. So this is the problem. It doesn't mean that it's going to be directly, I don't know, targeted at fuel rods and exactly this time the catastrophe is going to happen. But still, this is problematic. And they just generally are not designed for that. The second thing is that neither nuclear security concept nor nuclear safety explicitly address threats from state actors. Now, since the International Atomic Energy Agency provides the instructions of what should we do in case of emergency, in case of nuclear safety malfunctions, in case of nuclear security, for example, threats, sabotage, and so on, we are considering non-state actors, meaning that, for example, we're trying to deal with a group of terrorists who are armed. Usually, against the group of terrorists, we need just the gates and some heavy guys who can just protect you with guns. So it's actually, the name of the concept, guards, guns, and gates. So nuclear security and nuclear safety were not addressing the threats from state actors. You should understand it's kind of hard to compare the state army and just armed group of terrorists. So this is absolutely different thing, and that's why it's problematic. And the last one, well, the last one in this presentation. There are no international mechanisms to mitigate critical incidents like the one currently unfolding in Ukraine. Next slide, please. So we usually want to have like a little paper and to say, here, you're violating this document, hey. But obviously documents in war are violated quite frequently. We are trying to turn to the international humanitarian law and say, well, probably Geneva Conventions have something about it, and they do. They do have Article 56 on protection of works and installations containing dangerous forces. Now, this is the problem, because this article, since the beginning of the war, since the seizure of our nuclear facility, has been criticized for ambiguity. Why? Because here, for example, the first is that works or installations containing dangerous forces, this is radiation obviously, namely dams and nuclear electrical generating stations, which is important for us, shall not be made the object of attack, even when they are objects of military objectives. Cool, nice. Second point, the special protection against attack provided by paragraph 1 shall cease for a nuclear electrical generating station only if it provides electric power in regular, significant, or direct support of military operations and so on. And if such attack is the only feasible way to terminate such support. Why is the problem? Because, well, this can be used by the belligerent states just to justify that, yeah, we're attacking nuclear power plant just because, yeah, it provides the support for the military operations. So this is the ambiguity. Of course, this is a huge debate whether we have to apply, conclude some other agreements in this field just to say, no, we cannot. But basically, personally, I do not think that this is the feasible way, but we can talk about it later, obviously. Next slide, please. So what has been done so far in Zaporozhye? I would say the only thing that could be done. Well, the main outcome is that we have the special support and assistance mission to Zaporizhia and to other plants in Ukraine. So basically, this is it. I mean, we have the monitoring mission at Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. We have the international organization saying that, you know, guys, everything's under control. This is a cool thing because, like, it's better than nothing, obviously. The main proposition and the main way on how to solve the issue would be the establishment of nuclear safety and security protection zone, which means not the demilitarized zone, but means that, you know, it just clear of everyone, of Ukrainians, Russians, and so on. But unfortunately, there is no way on how we can do this because, you know, some people think that if you have the International Atomic Energy Agency director coming to Ukraine, like, why cannot he do something? Why cannot just say, hey, go away? He cannot. Because this organization has only technical mandate and they just unable to make countries cease the military activity. And this is the only way how you can actually end it. But yeah, this is pretty much the one thing that we've done. And this is what's helping us, for example, to understand what's going on with this mining of the power plant. Because Ukrainians say, yeah, it is mined. Russians say, no, it is not. And now we have the third guy who's going to check everything and say, oh, yeah, you know, we see it here, we see it here not. So the only problem is that, again, as it's technical mandate, they cannot access certain parts of power plant without the authorization for the newly authority to the nuclear power plant. So this is the shortcoming. So what are the conclusions? Next slide, please. So the first conclusion, it would be nice to have the bilateral agreements in place. For example, between India and Pakistan, I hope that you know that there's quite a rivalry between them. They have the special agreement on non-attacking the nuclear installations in case of war. Again, it can be violated, I know, but it's better than nothing. So probably for other conflict-prone regions, when you have such conflict, it's better to have something like that in place for it to be like as a confidence-building measure mainly. Then, obviously, a state actor can jeopardize the safe and secure operation of nuclear power plants and civil nuclear infrastructure. This is not cool. We have to deal with this somehow. We have to probably think about the recommendations that EIA can issue for the countries that have conflicts in their territory and probably to be prepared for such outcome. And, yeah. We should be generally acting. This is the main conclusion. So thank you for your attention.
Okay, so dear colleagues, it's a pleasure to be here with you. My name is Daria Lutsenko. I study philosophy at the Odeskiego National University at the Department of Philosophy at the Faculty of Philosophy and History. And today we are going to talk about the space of pause and silence as an evidence of liminality. But first of all, let's try to figure out what does liminality actually is and what gives us an opportunity to talk legally, to use it as a scientific term, and well, what heuristic potential does this concept has? So liminality as the phenomenon was, could you open next slide, please? Was articulated by ethnographers and anthropologists with the framework of the study of archaic society by Arnold van Gennep and Victor Turner. And the understanding of the phenomenon of liminality was developed and applied to a whole range of anthropological phenomena, actually by Victor Turner. And the common thing that made it possible for such expansion for research with the framework of modern processes is the phenomenon of crisis, which actually accompanies humanity during all its history long, both on individual and universal being levels. So it should be noted that researchers consider to take liminality in a very broad range of senses. For example, denoting a phenomenon like on the edge or being in between state or in-betweens. Others who are working with this concept, they tend to divide it and to separate liminality from other very related closely phenomena like hybridity or frontier, or, well, a range of similar phenomena. If we remind ourselves the idea of Max Weber, he has a very, I think, beautiful and fruitful metaphor of describing what culture is. He says that a human being is like a spider who spins a web, and finally on which he finds himself being suspended. And actually this web is culture. But how can we explore this web, and what are the ways of finding out the roots and the essence of these connections that actually this web creates? And he states that the methods of analyzing this web is not actually the experimental science, but consists in interpretation and research of meanings. So human behavior, decision-making, ways we build our relationship, I mean different kinds of relationship like working, friendly, and any others are the consequences and the result of symbolic forms embedded in culture. Open the next slide, please. Yeah. So here we can see Ernst Cassirer and a scheme. Actually, this scheme shows the world of culture, which combines various symbolic forms. Symbolic forms, we all know them. It's like religion, Kunst, the art, of course, the language. The central part of it is the myth. Ernst Cassirer has very special understanding and gives a special place in a culture to the concept of myth and its meaning. And the culture is actually the things that combines all these things all together and creates such a very beautifully and symbolic forms. And the concept of an intelligent person, the main anthropological concept, is replaced by a symbolical person. So each cultural area has its own way of combining details into its symbolical orders. And investigation the liminality and its aspect, let's turn to such a perspective as identifying its attributes. I mean the attributes of liminal states and of liminal experiences. And we will pay attention, of course, only to some of them. So to begin with, let us distinguish between the liminal stages in the rites of passages, and we will see it on the next slide. It's a main scheme of the rites of passages started by Arnold van Gennep and developed by the range of anthropologists and philosophical anthropologists. So when we have to pass from one state to another, we have to pass actually several stages. And the first stage is separation, when we have an old identification, an old self, and actually we are losing this self. And it's sometimes very painful, actually always painful. The second stage is liminality, or the transformation state, the transition state, and it's the things that I'm interested at. There are some points that are usual, well, it's thought to be usual for this state, like spiritual opening, like a state betwixt and between. It's also a threshold, another symbol and synonym of liminality. And this phase should finish with the incorporation. It means that after this transformation, we gain some new self. Talking we, I mean not only our personal perspective, but it can also be applied to a huge range of big historical transformations. So, and at the stage of the passage, we experience this special kind of liminal experience. And the main actor here is a liminal person or a liminal subject. It has some very special characteristics. The first of all, it comes from the very special identification of this liminal stage, because it's a phase where the subject comes through the layers which are not limited by any historical and cultural perspectives, like he has no future, he has no past, he has only the present state. So it's a kind of such a duality that describes the liminal subject. In addition to duality of liminal subject, they tend to escape from the cover of classifications and definitions, and it's really rather to give some clear definition of this state and of the subject who suffers this state. Open the next slide, please. So, and the liminal person resembles, well, personally me, I think it's so, the figure of ancient Proteus who owed his elusiveness being the one who is very difficult to capture, to the ability not to take on concrete forms, and who actually endowed with prophetic wisdom. So there are, we may say, negative and positive aspect of the liminality. And in this way, we may say that it's a kind of homologization and homogenized identity of liminal subject. And in this way, it is the way to open such phenomenon that Turner called the communitas, what the communitas actually is. He notes that working with the theme of liminality, he went from the idea of communitas as the result of biological desire just to break free, to break all the rules and limitations. To the idea of communitas that a product of specifically human existence, and which includes rationality, will, memory, experience, and social life. But it's a social life of a very special kind. In communitarian communication, first of all, horizontal connections are built, not vertical. And there is a kind of communication that could be described as I-thou, according to the terms of Martin Buber. Open the next slide, please. Yeah. What does it mean to be in a communication, to have a relationship like I-thou? Because the opposite way to build a relationship, due to Buber, actually it won't be a relationship, it will be an experience. We may argue, but still. To be in relationship is only to be in I-thou relationship. And it is characterized that this relationship with such a time aspect like being held only in present time, here and now actually. And the other way to deal with the world, to deal with other people, is to be in experience like I eat. Yeah, and it's usually based on our past experience, past expectations, and have nothing in common with the present situation. And liminal homologization of subjects opens the way to a type of communication that Buber called an ontological dialogue. So it can also, it can only be held in the kind of relationship like I-thou. And it's a possibility of such way of interaction that has its source, the essential core of the subject, and appeals to the reality of the same level in the other one. And at this stage, the distancing of liminal person from non-liminal person is probably inversely proportional to the distance in communication of communitarian kind. And in this dimension, distance acquired a positive connotation as the result of liminal experience. And so this model assumes that homology digests, not digests, but actually it reduces the functional attributive layerings that cover our certain essence, certain core. And actually this essence remains. And it remains unchanged and can enter into a direct dialogue. And Buber sees in such communication a certain mystical experience that is associated with the experience of silence, which is the conditionally positive pole of liminal experience and of liminal state. And as the absence of some extra noise, of some excessive noises, and the presence of sufficient space and conditions for listening to the essence which happens right here and right now. The communitas is eventually transformed into structure. Actually, it's destiny in any way. And equal horizontal connections between people are transformed into structural connections between social persons. So if you remind yourself, can we see slide 4 once more? Slide 4. Yeah. So if we remind ourselves this scheme, it's a transitional phase, and later or sooner, we have to be here. We have to come into the incorporation stage, where actually these connections build into some social structures. And communitas is contemplative itself, and it has a great and actually generous potential for ideas, for philosophical ideas, and for imaginary, I think. So Turner points to an interesting phenomena when people understanding, or rather feeling, the power and potency of communication, of communitas, attempted to manifest spontaneous communitas through the reproduction of rituals, without being actually in a clear crisis. Life in the middle of the communitas is filled with affects, which, however, can be a lure or even an obstacle on the way, since the communitas, like liminality, is just an only intermediate stage on the way to a new structure. So the charm of the communitarian state prompts the search for means for its reproduction under some cultural, not cultural, but I mean, outside some liminal practices. So, finishing up with the scheme, I may figure out that we have seen I think, outstanding example of this liminal experience and organizing of communitas on the volunteer movement, which started with the start of a full-scale Russian-Ukrainian war, where the horizontal connections were actually those who, they were actually only the one reliable things which people could find at these circumstances, and it really worked. So, okay, that's all. Thank you for your attention.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maria Marchenko. I am on my 4th way of education in Odessa National University at the Department of Microbiology, Virology, and Biotechnology. And for today, my topic is the Pseudomonas spinosum production for bioelectrochemical systems. I suppose that not all of you are into biology field, so I will try to make it easier for your understanding. Next slide. So I want to start with a little background. The expansion of the global population has led to a continuous lead in energy consumption. Consequently, there is a growing demand for the development and consistent improvement of renewable energy sources to meet global energy demands. So these have rapidly emerged as promising sustainable technologies for energy-efficient wastewater treatment, more sustainable bioremediation, and other potential applications. But what does BESS means? What is it? Bioelectrochemical systems, or BESS, encompasses a group of technologies derived from conventional electrochemical systems, in which the electrodic reactions are directly or indirectly linked to the metabolic activity of the certain types of the microorganisms. Just in a simple way, electrons are transferred to the BESS electrodes either by direct content of the microorganism or by using soluble mediators. Next slide. So as to the process, the released electrons from these microbial redox processes are transferred from the microbes to the anode through various mechanisms of this electron transfer. This electron transfer has been divided into two types. First one is the direct one. That means that you have a chamber from anode and cathode and your microorganism, and between them there is no mediator, so that the microorganism has electroactivity, so it is the direct way between them. And indirect one, like mediator electron transfer, that means that between anode and microorganism there is a mediator, soluble mediator, that can transfer these electrons to the anode. So in this case, exactly, phenazines can be used as these electron mediators. Next one. So the natural mediators produced by Pseudomonas aeruginosa are termed phenazines. Although these secondary metabolites are known for the different roles, we will discuss it later, they also have been shown to enhance bacterial survival. So recently, biotechnologically important strain like Pseudomonas putida has been engineered to produce these phenazines, thereby boosting the prospects of using these redox active compounds for electron transfer in electrochemical processes. And just the next slide. In particular to global, you can see on these slides our phenazine derivatives, the usage of them. So maybe the most brightest of them is OLED application. Just in our everyday life, we have these phenazines on our displays. And of course, electron shuttle, energy generation, microbial fuel cells, that's about this report is. Next one. So as to the practical experiment of my work. So first of them, the aim of this work was to compare the amount of intensity of Pseudomonas phenazine production. So we used the three following strains like Pseudomonas fluororafis, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, and Pseudomonas fluorescens respectively. So first of all, we did a bacterial pre-cultivation that was carried out on the MPA medium for 24 hours. And then bacterial biomass was transferred to the following nutrient medium, can be agar, without agar-agar supplementation. Then the studied microorganisms were grown during 7 days and 25 degrees. Every 24 hours, the cell suspension density was measured by the spectrophotometer for 540 nanometers. And then the phenazine extraction of the Pseudomonas studied strains was carried out according to the Levitch methodology. So the study of the microorganism growth dynamics show their gradual biomass increasing over time. Just in this slide, you can see the biomass accumulation as to the standard liquid medium. So we can see that biomass accumulation is small, less pronounced, but more pronounced for the stationary phase. That's the phase of the growth for a microorganism when we can select the secondary metabolites that are used in this presentation, like phenazines. And the next one. And of course, king agar. You can see that for two Pseudomonas strains, stationary phase begins on the 5th day, but it is less pronounced. And for one of these strains, the growth phase may be shifted. So the determination of the culture medium composition influenced the intensity of biomass accumulation, detected that the highest cell level number of all tested cultures was in liquid variant of king agar. So the phenazine concentration determination revealed that Pseudomonas aeruginosa and Pseudomonas fluorescens may show they are most active producers for phenazines. So you may ask me, why do you use such a strains like Pseudomonas? And I will ask you that due to their normal capacity and because of the thing that they can utilize many non-expensive substrates and unprecious in cultivation and their simplicity. So these characteristics improve me that they are the main, like in this case. And maybe the next question you may ask, why do you use PCA accumulation? The next slide. Because of the thing that because like it is considered to the PCA or phenazine 1 carboxylic acids to be like the beginner of the all phenazines, like you can see on this slide. So the arrows goes to the pioxanine or the phenazine 1 carboxyamides. So it's like their ancestor. The next one. So a little bit time to conclusions. So that phenazine's accumulation intensity depends on Pseudomonas species. Like whatever you will try to accumulate, there will be the different results due to your choice. And the anionic metal ion presence in this Kenga A-B liquid wherein significantly simultaneous the phenazine concentrations that are released by the cultures. However, these characteristics don't correspond to the studied Pseudomonas cell biomass accumulation nodes. Next one, and maybe the most interesting part of this report. Oh, so microbial fuel cell market, is it beneficial for people? Of course, yes. The microbial fuel cell market focused is segmented on the basis of type, application, and region. So on the basis of the type, market is categorized into mediators and non-mediators. Based on type mediator, it is the largest segment during the forecast period that is contributed to producing that renewable sources of energy. So MFC or microbial fuel cells means that we are used microorganisms to produce electricity, are mostly likely to be used in the near future to produce electricity while simultaneously treating wastewater. And the next one, on the basis of the application, it is divided into power generation, wastewater treatment, biosensors, and others. Based on application, power generation holds the highest markets during the focus period, and as a result, there is expected to be an increase in demand for these microbial fuel cells in low to medium power generation applications. Yeah, and region-wise, the market is studied across North America, Europe, Asia Pacific, and LAMEA regions. Based on the region, Asia Pacific is the fastest growing region during the focus period. It is contributed to made the market for the microbial fuel cells has been strong demand because power consumption is in industry and residential sectors has increased. So thank you for your attention. Maybe you have some questions. No question. Okay. These technologies are now like have the clinical studies in India and maybe in China for due to the circumstances of the technologically improvement. So it can be used in the near future. It's my bachelor work, so I'm now working on my diploma and doing such a battery with this microorganism, and I will waiting for my results and maybe it will be published. Thank you too.